Hi, and welcome to Module 4, the Middle East and East Asia. You're halfway done the course now. Congratulations. And what have we looked at so far? Well, in Module 2, we looked at comparative higher education and comparative education, two paradigms that approach comparison quite differently. The first looks at history, context, values, religion, and establishes these as foundational for any scholarship on education systems. Comparative higher education, in contrast, is a paradigm that really uses a political economic lens to look at current events. And both have a place in this course. In Module 3, we looked at ancient traditions. This is a topic that I love, and I think it's a really unique offering for this particular course because we are not the first people to take part in higher learning communities. For thousands and thousands of years, civilizations have asked the big questions about life, about social life, about religion, about mathematics. And for us to see where we sit atop those traditions is very important. What echoes might we see of the past, and how might the historic traditions give us an alternative to the modern rationalist machine that we're part of right now, and the homogenizing effect of colonialism? So I love Module 3. Today, we're going to look at East Asia and the Middle East. But let's start with the Middle East. Actually, let's start by trying to define this group of countries in the Middle East that sits between three continents and are often debated which place they belong. So there are several terms you're going to see when you're beginning to research this area. First, there's MENA, and this is actually just an acronym for the Middle East and North Africa. And then there is the term the Maghreb. And this often refers to Northwest Africa, the often former colonial French countries, the site of the Arab Spring. And then there's the Levant. The Levant is looking at the Eastern Mediterranean: Cyprus, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria. Iraq is sometimes linked in here, but for different political reasons. And then the GCC is considered the Gulf Coast countries, or the Gulf Cooperative Council. And these are countries like the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Saudi. Countries that are trying to establish themselves at the center of the knowledge economy. Now, hopefully you looked at this and you said, who's missing? And you'll notice that countries like Egypt, Iran, Iraq, and Turkey sit between the two regions, the geographic regions. And this actually makes them quite controversial. And depending on who's setting up the geographical boundaries, you're going to have them placed in different spaces. There's a great book called Paris 1818, and it actually describes the process of the European powers dividing up the Middle East after World War I. And it was done really arbitrarily. So all of these divisions are actually the space of scholarship, the space that we can study and understand the belonging. So as we begin to look at post-secondary education, what types of communities are being formed, what type of organizations, and who is or isn't included in each one? So for us in this module, we're going to use the term the Middle East for simplicity. And we're going to consider how post-secondary education in the Middle East compares to other regions. First, the Middle East actually does share some features with Latin America. The post-colonial reforms that have defined the sort of system structure, there's very strong government control, and there's frequent student unrest. But the huge disparity in the region is really what sets the Middle East apart. There's a great quote from the Herrera reading. I doubt that our invention of the academic police can be adopted by the West, but it might be exportable to Latin America. And this is because the student unrest in both locations, students having a lot of ownership and seeing higher education as something they can impact, and that's worth their time to protest and hold to account. So it's a great research paper comparing the two regions and how student activism has played out there, what the rationales are behind that, what are the outcomes. Now, of course, this is a satirical comment, but it does reveal to us that the government imposition in the Middle East is a defining feature. The Middle East also shares some commonalities with China because it has this real pressure to modernize, and it's borrowed extensively from the European models. Now, in your first reading, Dr. Elizabeth Buckner helps to give a sense of the student experience within this system and how students are sorted using the examination system. She helps bring in larger trends about the labor market demands, the government control, and the social stratification related to institutional reputation that comes from this. So enjoy that reading. The second reading by Herrera uses this metaphor of battlegrounds, and sometimes actually it's not metaphorical, it's literal. She says that the combination of authoritarian governmental regimes and oppressive opposition forces, both of which tend to use education institutions as figurative and literal battlegrounds, bodes especially poorly for the prospering of free and productive academic cultures. So when we look at the culture wars, the physical wars, the political wars, what battlegrounds, what battles are being fought in the Middle East? Well, as we've mentioned before, the colonial powers fought for the Middle East and used the universities to mark their territories. There are examples of a university being built right next to the university because the colonial power just did not want to relinquish control. In the present day, nationalism has meant that education was taken back from the colonial powers, and universities were seen as very important to the new nation, sort of staking its claim and its identity. Big debates have centered around the universities. So, how much of the colonial institution should be kept and how much should be changed? And each time there's a new government, these debates resurface. Islamization is the broader cultural battles in the Middle East. These strongly influence the universities as well. Some universities and governments have appealed to Islamic values of education. That's very important because Islam has a beautiful history of valuing education and higher learning, the incredible libraries of the Middle East that you learned about. So some governments tap into that and say, this is who we are, let's build our education system. But others have used religion as a mantra to reinforce gender roles or to bring a very narrow Islamic curriculum to the university. So the interpretation of religious positioning in society is really important here. And it's particularly interesting because in the conservative protest side of the Arab Spring, education was being held up as a key Islamic value. But in the GCC, it's also an important value, but not in relation to how we become good Muslims, but that at our core as Islamic people, we are educators. And so they use it in different contexts to call for certain actions, but for very different ends. The next article is by Romani. And while there are some similar themes to Herrera, it really focuses on the politicization of higher education. Lots of conversation about Palestine and the way that certain higher ed institutes and sectors have really developed in response to the Middle East's political climate. One of the historic political shifts that he identifies that's particularly interesting is the decrease in academic power for Egypt and the attempts of the GCC to increase their academic power. Egypt has always been the academic stronghold of the Middle East. It has always had the largest universities, the most connections with international university providers. Going back thousands of years as well, with Alexandria, Egypt had this center of learning. But the GCC has really worked to become global knowledge players in the global knowledge economy. So they developed education hubs. They want to have lots of student mobility going through there. But what's happened is as the GCC has risen in their economic power as well as their educational power, it's actually Egyptian academics that are migrating to the GCC to help to run these institutions. So this becomes a really interesting thing because it's a form of regional brain drain. It's a similarity to Europe. Europe has regional brain drain where academics move from the periphery to the center or between different countries. And this is make a great term paper looking at academic brain drain, but within regional areas. And these changes really do reflect the post 9/11 world because there was less mobility outside of the region. And so the GCC became this big destination. And even then, even when people are sort of within their region, the global politics is still incredibly powerful. For instance, when there were prior to the Iranian sanctions of the mid-2000s, 30% of the Gulf students, international students, were actually from Iran. And then after the sanctions, they were unable to afford to come. And so the international community has influenced the makeup of international students in the Middle East. As the Iranians decreased, other students were sort of recruited into the Middle East. And I think that this quote is absolutely fascinating. The Gulf leaders aren't just seeking to close the development gap in their countries, they explicitly intend to reverse the balance of knowledge between the West and the Middle East. Their aim is to change the Arab Academy from a site of knowledge reception to one of knowledge production. So lots of funding for academics there, lots of funding for institutions. And I think some of the really exciting things are that There's a lot of opportunity. We can focus a lot on the political tension and unrest of the Middle East, but we can also see that there are some key leaders who are making education a priority in their new national development. And the Qatari Foundation is a huge example of that. The First Lady of Qatar is a huge advocate for education, lots of funding and building of education, seeing this as our greatest asset for our people, this sort of language, which is really important. And in fact, that was the group that called for rankings about 10 years ago when the Middle East suddenly joined into the ranking world. And it was a very smart time for the GCC to enter the world of rankings because there was such unrest in Egypt. And so as the rest of the area has unrest and the GCC says, rank us now, they came out quite favorably in that. So again, lots of opportunities here. It's not all dire, not all is lost by any means. There's lots of room for innovation and expansion in the Middle East right now. So the last reading is by Mazawi, and this is a really good reading if you have no experience looking at the Middle East as an area for higher education. This will give you a whole bunch of the key pillars of what has shaped that sector. So I would suggest starting with this if you're someone who has no background in this whatsoever. So as much as I want you to really to focus occasionally on the positive things, on the things where there is room for innovation and where there are key education advocates changing sectors, the Arab Spring is still a fascinating example of unrest that has shaped the area. And I think for a lot of us, we watched this on the news, but wouldn't have known necessarily how the universities were involved. None of the readings actually address this in depth, but I do want you to consider that universities were the main spaces for the different groups to meet and confront each other. So here is a quick overview, Grace's quick Cole's notes on the Arab Spring. Keep this tucked in the back of your brain as you read the student movement articles for week 6, and consider the distinct nature of the Arab Spring in contrast to, for instance, the Latin American or South African student protests. So the Arab Spring started in 2010. The catalyst is often considered to be when a produce vendor in Tunisia set himself on fire. He was protesting government and police corruption. He had a lot of interference in his business and a lot of requests for bribes and things. So he does this act, and then people would cite this act as a time where we decided not to be afraid of the government anymore. So within weeks of this, there are calls for Gaddafi in Libya to step down, for Mubarak in Egypt. We have the awful civil war in Syria breaks out. Even the tiny kingdom of Bahrain has months of protest. And in each location, it's the universities that become sites of violence and sites of resistance, because all these different groups in the country are demonstrating to show their vision for what things could be like after these leaders fall. And so there's a lot of nuance in the different memberships, the different groups that are at play, but there's a big division between the working class Muslim students and those that are seen as the elite secular groups. And the interpretation and the practice of Islamic law becomes a major polarizing debate within these universities. So one example is the role of women, whether they should be allowed to wear the niqab in university. Also, whether there should be separation between the genders, whether there should be prayer rooms available at all. And the secular elite, very aligned with European secularism, think French colonialism in this area, they do not want any of these within what they see as the pure academic space. But the working class Muslim people who say, this is our faith, our beliefs, this is the foundation of the culture of who we are, they are fighting to have this at the universities. And so all of these debates are happening within the universities by young idealists saying, this is what we want the future of our country to look like. And the universities are spaces that they're interacting to fight this out. And there are similar protests and debates in Egypt with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, lots of acts of violence on campus. The prescription of student dress code should ring some bells in your minds. And all the factors that influence how we ask students to behave on campus. This is a paper I have not read yet. I'd love to read this paper. Go and research this paper for me. But for those of you who have lived in Canada for a few decades, you're going to know that in Quebec, also a place with French colonial ties, we get embroiled in similar debates. Should male police be allowed to wear Sikh head coverings? Should Muslim women be allowed to veil in public schools? And there are reasons that the European secular approach was against these things. But the way it then plays out in the colonies is very complex. I mean, it still is complex the way it plays out in France as well. But we begin to see these large divisions in society as these beliefs clash with each other on university campuses. And what's always so interesting to me is that geographically, sort of in terms of campus environment, These universities are not like the University of Toronto. We have no walls. It is the urban center of the city. We sprawl across roads and we sprawl across parks. But many of the universities where the protests are located, they're walled. There's security, there's checkpoints to enter. So you begin to see that even physical space reflects the issues that are at play here. So let's ask a few questions about the Middle Eastern reading. Is political stability a requirement for full participation in the knowledge society? You read my article at the beginning of the semester, and I asked a similar question about restrictive immigration policies. Can their universities fully make the most of their human capital if they have these restrictive immigration policies? How is the university a space within a broader political, cultural, religious context? And can it exist without adapting and responding to that? How can it be a player in the peace process is another huge question we want to ask. So when you're faced in your university with big polarizing debates, and remember, since the time that I wrote that article, the US has shown huge political debates, huge different views on things. And those have echoed into Canada in certain ways. Can universities have intentional programming to begin to bring different sides together? Is that our role? Can that be our role? So lots of questions about the Middle Eastern readings. I hope you enjoy those and find yourself fascinated by them. Today, we're also looking at East Asia as the second part of Module 4. And of course, we're so fortunate to have a reading by Dr. Hayhoe. So Dr. Hayhoe's reading is on the Asian multiversity. She's taking Clark Kerr's concept of this, and she's beginning to ask, does this match the East Asian context? So this is a classic example of comparison. And I want you to begin to see how she does this as a real model. We take a concept and then we say, does this work in a different context? And then we systematically look at the features and do a comparison to say what matches and what doesn't. We use one almost as the ruler to measure the other, and then use the findings from the other to create a new model. So look at this article. I'm not going to go into depth on the East Asian readings because you've heard from her already in the course and she's coming as a guest speaker. So you are going to read these. You're going to look into them. You'll have questions you can bring to class, but I won't go into too much more depth. Nakayama's article on Japanese post-secondary systems is really interesting because during the Meiji period, Japan brings in very intentionally little bits that they choose from other systems, very carefully, very systematically. But then post-World War II, when the Americans come in, there is a much larger imposition of academic systems. And how has that played out? And of course, Marginson's Confucian model, a really important piece that he wrote examining how the East Asian model of the university actually draws on Confucian values or has Confucian values embedded in it. So for instance, parents paying a huge amount of money for their children to attend university, state and systematic control over the institution and the outcomes, the one chance examination system. So look for the features that he describes as the Confucian model. Fun fact, Dr. Hayhoe was a reviewer when he first put out this article. And I think he now is using the term sort of post-Confucian societies, but there's still a lot of conversation to have about what is distinct about the East Asian model, what was brought in by colonialism, and what comes from a pre-colonial cultural heritage. So by now, I'm sure you're beginning to pull out some of the differences and similarities between the Middle East and East Asia, beginning to see them as contexts that could be compared. And I'm particularly fascinated by the idea of student movements and social uprisings. We have a theme related to this in week 6, so I don't want to steal any thunder from that group. But the Hong Kong protests of 2019 do provide a really interesting comparison with the Arab Spring, both happening in the last 15 years, both having universities as sites of incredible political protest. So let's think about those for a second. What was similar? Well, the colonial histories of each can be looked at broadly as similar, though they have distinct nuances. Of course, until 1997, Hong Kong was a British protectorate. And even after that, it had certain laws that it was exempt from in China. Both contexts had a catalyst that sort of lit the fire of protests in the universities. For Hong Kong, it was the expedition laws, the idea that people in Hong Kong would be able to be removed to China for legal reasons and be tried there. And this was seen as a huge infringement on personal freedom. After the social movements kind of in the streets with the general population, the protests moved very specifically to different universities, the Polytechnic and the other Hong Kong university. That's my name is slipping my mind. And these were incredible sights. The students had barricaded the roads. The students stocked up in a very organized way with weapons, with masks, like gas masks, with other equipment, with food, and they had it all organized, feeding hundreds of people that were inside, barricaded in as the police waited for them to exit. It became this sort of try and escape, cause disruption, try to block major roads, then trying to escape the campuses once it became clear that they were trapped there. Incredibly disturbing thing to be watching as we began to see sort of personal freedom, this fight between the police and the students and their personal freedoms being taken away. But what is really different about these two contexts? Presence of religion. So religion was a very central component in the Middle Eastern, in the Arab Spring, the ideas of how do we interpret Islamic law. Economic problems and corrupt government was a huge problem in the Middle East, and people saw the governments as responsible for having the inefficiencies in the economy that were preventing them from getting jobs and really having people concerned about their futures. And yet in Hong Kong, you have students who are at elite universities who are still protesting, and so it really was this idea of worrying about freedom and about democracy. But there's probably more to that as well. It's not something I've studied in depth. And again, this would make a great comparative paper. But asking these questions, where do we see the similarities and where do we see that the drives, the rationales, and perhaps the outcomes as well are quite different? There was no fall of the government in China as a result of this, but there was the rolling back of the expedition law for a time. So really interesting things to begin to think about. And I'd love to hear your opinions in class. Have a great week, and I will see you there. Bye.